You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Ross Kay from Ross Kay Realty Consultants. Welcome to the show, Ross.
Thanks, Jim. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. What about yourself?
Not too bad. Glad to be back.
The Canadian Real Estate Association released figures recently saying that annually sale prices were up over 9%. Is this an accurate figure, or is it so out of date it doesn't mean anything?
Well, it's out of date. It's an accurate figure in terms of how the Canadian Real Estate Association calculates their numbers. So the Canadian Real Estate Association is not outright lying to the population, but it is not a number that the average homeowner should certainly be looking at. It's not a number that is representative of what's really going on. If you looked at March's number, it's actually a 6.48% increase last March of 2014 to this March of 2015. So the Canadian Real Estate Association reports it as a 9% increase. What they're actually doing is they're not really reporting the average sale price. They're reporting the average sale price for the homes that sold between March the 1st and March the 31st. So that is not what we would, any appraisal, any appraiser, any real estate professional would never legally be able to say that number publicly, or they would be brought up on charges by your provincial regulator. The average sale price is what a house would appraise at. It wouldn't appraise at what just sold in March. It would appraise at what sold probably in the last six months to 12 months. So you need to be careful when you're hearing these numbers that you're looking at something that's reflective of how the market has changed. So the real change that took place in Canada was a 6.48% increase from March the 30th, 2014 to March the 30th, 2015. It was not a 9% increase. This is using the exact same information the Canadian Real Estate Association itself has. It's just presenting it in a manner that the consumer could understand instead of presenting it in a way that benefits realtors to help them sell more houses. That's why you'll never hear a realtor say the Canadian average sale price has increased by 9%. Because if they did, they would be up in charges before the provincial regulator.
Now, why would they announce a different price than you?
Because it benefits the organization. If you look at what they released, they said that the average selling price for the month of March was $439,144. If you asked me, I would say it was $413,949. So the difference between the number that we release and the number that the Canadian Real Estate Association releases is about $26,000. To me, $26,000 is a tremendous amount of money. So it's important that you don't release numbers that create a misrepresentation of what the average selling price is. You got to remember, the Canadian Real Estate Association is a non-profit trade organization whose only legal obligation is to represent the best interests of their members. There is nothing in the Constitution, the bylaws, or the legal filings for the Canadian Real Estate Association that states that they must release any information that's for the public good or for public benefit. There is no mandate in that organization to do that. This is the assumption that has drastically caused major problems across this country to take place in the last 14 years. People have learned to believe what they hear instead of asking for clarification. So clarification would have been, no, the average sale price on March the 30th was not $439,144. Of the houses that we sold during the month of March, between March the 1st and March the 31st, those houses sold at an average selling price of $439,000. In fact, the average selling price of a house in Canada on March the 31st was $413,949 and that's how an appraiser would express that when you go to get a mortgage at the bank.
Does this so-called national average price mislead people? Because in Canada, each local market is totally different from the one next to it.
Right, but all real estate associations release the numbers the exact same way. So if I flip over to Vancouver for the sake of the argument, when I'm looking at Vancouver, they express it in a different way. It really works. It's really important when a market starts to correct, because the way that they release the numbers, it hides what's really going on in the market. So your listeners are going to know that Alberta, Calgary, and Edmonton, Fort McMurray, those markets have all had massive reductions in the number of sales that are taking place. Yet, if they listen to the press releases from those associations, they're going to hear that the average sale price has increased in March of 2015 versus March of 2014. Well, of course it had increased, because you're talking about a year later, and you had months and months of strong price growth. If they talk to us, we would say the average sale price in Calgary has decreased almost $2,000 since January 1st of 2015, and that it's accelerating the rate of deceleration, or the rate that the prices are starting to drop, is increasing. So as time goes on, and as a real estate market corrects itself, housing prices, the decrease going on in housing prices gets faster and faster and faster until all the surplus is wiped out of a housing market. That's the part that is hidden when you listen to the average monthly sales stat from any real estate association. I did a Google search. I had 3 of my partners do Google searches, trying to find one place anywhere in Canada where the average selling price has been accurately displayed from even the year 2000 forward. You can't find it anywhere. There is not one published. When you look at a chart created by Organized Real Estate, you see up and down Geiger counter moves like you see in the stock market. Well, those moves don't take place in a real estate market, in a realty market. It's a constant level increase or decrease in value that takes place. It's the speed at which that increase is taking place, or that decrease is coming home to bear, that matters to the consumer, because that tells you how quick you're going to be underwater if you purchased a house 12 months earlier. That's the important number that consumers need to know. For some reason, that number cannot be found, or a chart of that nature cannot be found on a Google search anywhere in Canada. The only charts that you can find that resemble that are charts where they have the year-end statistics are published. So if you look for if you did a Google search on the average selling price of a Canadian home, and you click Google Images, you're going to see charts that have from 1982 forward, where it's the year total average selling price that's reported. But you will never see one that has every single month and a smooth line going forward, because they don't calculate average selling price. They only calculate the sales that took place in one given month. Consumers should never look at those numbers, because the person who comes in to appraise your house for a bank mortgage will never look at those numbers. If the appraiser looked at those numbers and used them, the appraiser would find themselves out of a job and probably being sued by the bank for issuing false appraisals. So what I'm saying here is, even though it sounds atrocious, it sounds outrageous, one call to a local appraiser will tell you exactly what I'm saying is correct.
How do you know what's a good price to sell your house for, or what's a fair price to pay?
Okay, so what's a good price to sell my house for? Obviously, like any asset, you prefer to, if you're going to sell, you'd love to sell it at the peak of the market. You'd love to sell it right on the very most expensive day for that asset that occurs. Now, what I'm going to tell you is measuring that day is impossible. But what you can do is you can know how much risk is involved the longer you wait. Now, how do you measure risk? Everybody's heard about housing bubbles. Now, what is a housing bubble and how is it measured? Well, if you look at all of the information that's available in all the studies around the world, housing bubbles are always measured by the average selling price. That's how they always measure them. Robert Shiller down in the States, who created the Case-Shiller Index, which is very similar to the Terra National Bank Home Price Index. Both numbers that really are out of line of what's really taking place in the market. Where the Case-Shiller Index is relevant is that in the United States, they don't have a real estate infrastructure the same that we have in Canada. They can't get an actual number for a single state, let alone a country. Where in Canada, we have accurate measures. If someone wants to take the time to get them, we have accurate measures available, locally, regionally, provincially, and nationally. Those numbers are the most accurate in the world. There is no other real estate infrastructure in the world today that operates like the Canadian system does. So that's one of the good things about our system. What that allows to happen is you can measure how much risk is currently in the estimate of equity you have in your current home. So for the sake of the argument, let's use Vancouver or Toronto and all of this talk about $1 million home. The average, you can't get a starter home is now close to $1 million is what you're reading in the newspaper. So let's say that you're 65 years old. You've owned real estate now for close to 40 years. You started out at $32,000, and now they're telling you your house is worth $1.2 million. Well, if you know that 40% of your current valuation is available to be corrected, removed from the market when the next house price correction takes place, there's a 40% risk of equity loss in your home. That 40% of your equity can disappear. So if you have a $1 million home and the housing bubble has reached 40%, that means you can only count on $600,000. There's $400,000 there that will sooner or later disappear because it is impossible for any housing market in North America to continue to go on an upward swing. It is impossible. The reason it's impossible is if that very cheapest house in your neighborhood doesn't sell, that means the most expensive house in your neighborhood will never sell. There's a direct causal effect between the sale of the most expensive home and the cheapest home, and that's called the sales chain. A lot of the focus you've heard being talked about are first-time buyers, and this gets directly right back to what is my risk or when should I sell my home? Well, first-time buyers, you look at the incomes of the people who purchase first-time homes. They're that category of people between 28 and 35 to 36. Go to StatsCan and find out whatever the average income is for those folks. Go into your mortgage chart and see what the current interest rate is, and then go into a mortgage calculator and figure how much those people can buy on average. That's going to tell you how much a first-time buyer will pay for a house. What I can tell you is in Canada, that was around $234,000 last month. So the average Canadian first-time buyer would pay $234,000 for a house. If that sale doesn't take place, the owner of that house, who's waiting for someone to buy it so they can go out and buy another home, a more expensive home, that person can never move. And that goes every time there's a step up the sales chain. That's exactly what takes place. So this equity difference, the risk, it exists at the lowest price point as it does at the highest price point, and that has been consistent from 1982 forward. That has never changed. It's just a real hard number. It's just the path that real estate has to follow. So when we're talking about what's the best time to sell, well, if you're going to buy a bigger house, a more expensive home, or if you're going to continue to own real estate for the next 10 years, then probably any time is the right time to sell, because you're moving to a property that should appreciate on the same percentage that the lower priced home that you currently own is experiencing. So if you go up 30% on $1 million, it's $300,000. If you go up 30% on $500,000, it's $150,000. So technically, the sooner you move in an accelerating price point market, the further ahead you are. But what you have to realize is these prices cannot go on forever. It is simply a mathematical impossibility, because unless that first home sells, which requires someone who can afford to buy it, the rest of the sales in the sales chain won't take place. So when I'm purchasing that $1 million property, or if I'm that person who's 65, I've owned real estate for 40 years, my house is now worth $1 million, I know that I'm going to be moving into a condo in the next couple of years. What I'm doing right now, today, is I'm listing my house for sale, because I've already seen an astounding, historically unprecedented amount of equity growth in my house during the last 14 years. Now, that equity growth is basically funded by low interest rate. That's how it takes place. That's why it's lasted 14 years. The current market that we're in at a national level, our prices have been increasing since 1999. That's when we wiped out the previous correction. So if you're asking someone, when should I sell? Well, you want to sell at the top of the market. You know you can't pick the exact day that's the peak of the market. And if you want to be selfish, you're going to get caught. So what you have to step back and say, I'm currently looking at a 40% risk if I wait 2 years from now. My house could be worth 40% less. I'm not willing to take that risk because I know I'm going to move in 2 years. So I'm going to list my house right now and move. Now the flip side is the first-time buyer. What should the first-time buyer do? Well, the first-time buyer knows right now interest rates are at historical lows. So that's causing them to rush out and buy a house because they're afraid next month the interest rate's going to be higher. Well, what I know and what everybody who studies housing trends should know is that if interest rates go up, housing prices are going to drop because the buyer doesn't get an increase in wages that's going to allow them to go out and afford a more expensive mortgage when interest rates go up. The result is average selling prices decrease, and that's a natural consequence of all real estate markets. It's all unavoidable, and anybody, any bank economist, CMHC, the Bank of Canada, anyone who says otherwise simply is ignorant to how all housing markets have to function. In your local market, you probably want to talk to someone who's been selling real estate for about 20 years. So if there's a realtor in your market who's been selling real estate for 20 years and they're selling at least 30 homes a year, they can reiterate what I'm explaining to you at your local level. If you're talking to someone who's only been in the business 10 years, they're not going to be able to explain this to you because they don't have the perspective of all the experience that's required to come up with these statements.
We'll have more with Ross Kay right after this.
More and more people are looking to the internet for intelligent, riveting, and thought-provoking interviews. To advertise on the Goddard Report and TalkDigitalNetwork.com, call 604-699-8600, 604-699-8600.
Welcome back. We're speaking to Ross Kay from Ross Kay Realty Consultants. Ross, every organization in the world, it seems, keeps saying that Canada's real estate is vastly overvalued, that there's a huge bubble anywhere from 25% to 50%. How accurate are these figures, and do they mean anything?
Well, how accurate are they? I can tell you precisely to the dollar that the current housing bubble in Canada, nationally, of the national sale price, so the current national average selling price in Canada as of March, let me just pull that up, Jim, so I don't make a mistake, was $413,949. That's how we measure. Of that price, 38.9% of it is up for a correction. When you're talking about the commentators from all over the world who are making these statements, even our own Bank of Canada governor, they're making statements that they can't back up with statistics. It's almost like they're pulling numbers out of hats based on a feeling that they have, based on what they read in a newspaper 2 days ago. These folks are not pulling up numbers that they can back up statistically. When we say there's a 38.9% inflationary pressure bubble on the current average selling price in Canada, we can back up that with a firm number that is based in real estate recorded data from 1982 to 2015. There is no debating it. There is no arguing it. They can sit down with us and they cannot win the argument. This is simply a fact. And when you understand how the infrastructure works, you would understand it's a logical fact. So when the IMF comes out and they say housing prices are on rent to income ratios or rent to house value rentals, the amount of rent you can get per month versus what the house costs a month to carry. What they don't understand is in Canada we have rent controls, and a $700,000 property under rent controls is still only renting for $1,700 a month because the person who's in it has lived there for 10 years. Their rent has only been able to increase with inflation, and they assumed that rental at a time when it was hard to rent a house. And the person who owned it was happy to even get it rented. So they rented it at a discounted price. That person never moved out. they stayed there. And each year, their rental payment went up with inflation. That's it. Even though the value of all the houses around them tripled or doubled. So when the IMF comes out with a statement, they don't realize the rules and regulations that are in place in Canada, which vary a little bit from province to province. So you've got to modify your answer to cover all those variables. They don't realize that. They're using a measure that works in France, in Spain, in maybe some southern parts of the United States. Those numbers have no relevance, have never had any relevance to Canada. When the Bank of Canada comes out and says, well, we see housing prices in a range between 10 and 30%. Okay, please give us a resource that we can check for the numbers that you're saying. Well, they don't have one. These are numbers they're just pulling out of a hat. When in fact, if they knew how a housing market actually operated, and again, I know how bizarre this sounds, it's a logical conclusion. We have spent the last 3 years reviewing 7 million real estate transactions in Canada. The transactions that took place from 1999 to the end of 2014. We're fully caught up with those, and now we only have to review the new ones that are coming out. In reviewing those transactions, we were able to take out data points from them and extrapolate that into a calculation. So what I know as a realtor for 27 years, what my 73-year-old mother knows, what my 75-year-old father knows, because they both sold thousands of houses, we know that housing prices increase for a specific reason, and we know why they increase. We know that because we've sold the same house over and over and over again to more people, and we hear the exact same thing every time we go to list it. So what I know is, from selling over 1,500 houses, is when I arrive to list that house for sale, the seller always has one thing and one thing to say. Ross, I'm willing to sell my house, but I'm not willing to lose any money. That's the one thing that has been consistent since my family has been selling real estate. We will sell our house, but we're not going to sell it at a loss. We'll wait till the market catches up to it, but I'm not going to sell it for a loss. So what does a loss mean? Well, a loss means inflation. Obviously, if inflation was 2% last year, your house was $100,000, you need to get $102 for it just to break even. And the fees that are included when you sell a house, they want those covered as well. So let's say, for the sake of the argument, it's going to cost you $6,000 to sell a house. When you get your the real estate fees, you've got your bank discharge fees, you've got your GST, your HST, all of those things, for the sake of the argument, let's say they add up to $6,000. So I've got $2,000 for inflation. I've got $6,000 for fees. I won't sell my house unless I get those covered. That means the house has to sell for $108,000. I know that that's just the way people are. They will not move unless they can at least break even. Now, how do you extrapolate that in a local market? Well, what we know, or what my family always felt we knew, was that housing prices basically go up whatever the real estate fees are. That's how much they go up. They go up inflation plus real estate fees. The only way to know if that was the truth was to review millions of real estate transactions for Canada. That's the only way that can be done. That's why this is impossible in any other country, because Canada has over 95% of the real estate transactions are recorded, and that data is available. No other country in the world even gets close. We're not even in the ballpark of what Canada is. So Canada really is the model for studying housing bubbles. When we go back to 1999, that's when the previous bubble had burst, and the 9 years that the correction was taking place. By the time the market turned and started to fully come out of that correction nationally, it was 1999. The following year, you started to see the housing bubble headed our way again. And then by 2004, the statistics showed the housing bubble had started to form. It has been no study of this anywhere in the world today. We completed the study. If you go to rossk.com right now, and this is so coincidental with this interview, Jim, and your listeners should know that you just contacted me yesterday, updating to do an interview today. This was not a prearranged thing 24 hours ago. We went live today with our housing bubble predictor, or what we call home equity risk index. Index. And what the Home Equity Risk Index has tracked from 1982 till today is the exact amount of risk or a correction that exists in the average selling price of a Canadian home. Between 1999 and 2014, 14 years in which inflation ranged from below 1% to almost 3%, varying each year at a different rate. When you subtract inflation plus the selling infrastructure fees, there is $1,614 difference remaining. In other words, on January the 1st, 2000, the average Canadian home was selling for the average Canadian sale price was $158,610. On December the 14th of 2014, it was $408,157. All of that increase in those 14 years, except for $1,614, was eaten up by inflation and real estate fees, selling infrastructure fees, all of it. So when you go back and people say, so what is my house really going to increase in value? What should I expect? I'm going to say the same thing my parents were saying back in the 1980s when I started the business. You should expect to get inflation. That's it. What you're doing is you're protecting your asset. Your asset is basically protected from inflation. That's what it is. You've got a great place to live and call home. You've got a great asset that when you pass away, someone else in your family is going to be able to share from your will. But to be expecting big gains is something that's not going to happen. We wrote a little story called The Little House That Sold. And this little house that sold represented the average house that sold in Canada between 1999 and December 31st, 2014. That little house that sold for over $4.4 million in those years. So when you add up all the times it sold, just simply following the average sale price of a home that was reported by the Canadian Real Estate Association, at the end of the year, for the total year, that little house that sold netted $1,614 to the last seller. That's it. Nowhere in Canada, anywhere, has anyone ever reported that to people. What I can tell you is that the selling infrastructure fees have declined between 1999 and 2014 on a fairly consistent basis, meaning it was impossible for us to fabricate these numbers, because in order to fabricate them and make them align with our theory, those fees each month would have to go up and down to offset the impact of the up and down movement of inflation. There's the list of fees that we have included decreases every year. I think the second year there was a bump because that was when there was a difference in one region of the country where the infrastructure fees were higher, and then it bumped it a little bit. Other than that, every single year it declined. And when you got done, $1,614. That's it.
Ross, thanks a lot for chatting with us.
Thank you, Jim.
I hope people learn something about what numbers to trust and which ones you should maybe take a look at a second or third time.
Well, they can head over to the website, Jim, because we have given public access to the national housing bubble right up till December the 14th. So there's no charge for that. They can go over. This is a public service that we're providing because they can't get this information anywhere else. And your listeners are the very first people in Canada to hear about it.
Thanks a lot again.
Thanks, Jim.
My guest has been Ross Kay from Ross Kay Realty Consultants. His website, rosskay.com. You're listening to HoweStreet.com Radio. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. You can find us on Twitter at Talk Digital Net. Comments about the show can be sent to info@HoweStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.
Comments made on HoweStreet.com Radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HoweStreet.com Radio is a production of HoweStreet Media Incorporated.